շարունակվում։
Please be seated. Sitting is open. The court meets this morning to hear the second round of oral observations of Azerbaijan on its request for the indication of provisional measures. I shall now give the floor to Ms. Catherine Amirfar. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, honorable members of the court, it is a privilege to appear before you again and on behalf of the Republic of Azerbaijan. Today I will start by addressing Azerbaijan's first and second provisional measures requests. First, I will address Armenia's argument that Azerbaijan's requests do not make out a plausible claim of discrimination under CERD. Second, I will turn to Armenia's jurisdictional objections regarding the temporal and substantive scope of Azerbaijan's requests. Finally, I will address Azerbaijan's request aimed at restraining Armenia's continued mining of Azerbaijan's territory. Armenia argued yesterday that there is no plausible violation of rights under CERD with respect to Azerbaijan's first request because, quote, landmines are defensive weapons, end quote, and, quote, by their nature do not engage in ethnic discrimination, end quote. We do not dispute that landmines themselves, once placed, do not discriminate, whether between the footfall of a journalist reporting on a story or a child playing in a field. The discriminatory purpose of Armenia's landmines is clear, however, in where and when Armenia laid the landmines, and in Armenia's ongoing refusal to provide accurate information about their locations. Indeed, the CERD Committee's urgent action procedures specifically reference discrimination involving landmines, and state reports contemplate specific discriminatory circumstances where landmines impact the ability of displaced ethnic communities from returning home. First, Armenia cannot refute the fact that landmines contaminate civilian areas of the formerly occupied territories. When Professor Murphy described the prior removal of purportedly, quote, defensive, end quote, landmines, he referenced mines, quote, along the line of contact, end quote, or along the Azerbaijan-Armenia border. To start, this seems to be a concession that any military purpose would only have existed at most along the line of contact or along the border, which address only a small fraction of the contaminated territory. Even more revealing is the fact that Armenia's submission yesterday did not address the landmines laid in civilian areas, except to argue that, quote, it is not certain they exist, end quote, or that, even in civilian areas, they, quote, may have been laid for defensive purposes, end quote. With respect, this is just sheer speculation. As to whether they exist, Professor Murphy cited to the Anama report, which does refer to the, quote, suspected minefields, end quote, in these areas. Precisely. This is how mine detection works in the absence of accurate information. If Azerbaijan knew with certainty where all of the landmines are, it would not need Armenia's landmine maps. And there's no evidence from Armenia that mines it placed in areas away from the line of contact were indeed defensive. Professor Murphy suggested, based on the Anama map, that the minefields in these areas, quote, fall along lines, a classic indication that these were further lines of contact, end quote. But to the contrary, the key to the map indicates that these minefields run in lines alongside roads and, quote, towns, settlements, and villages, end quote. Where is the evidence from Armenia's relevant ministries demonstrating that its landmines in these civilian areas had a defensive purpose? Armenia's silence on this point of evidence is deafening. But this silence is also understandable. Armenia's specific placement of landmines in civilian areas that had been home to vast majorities of ethnic Azerbaijanis has no conceivable military objective, is clearly discriminatory. There is no legitimate defensive reason, for example, for Armenia to plant landmines in villages in the Zengilan district, which is approximately 60 kilometers away from the line of contact, and had a population of over 30,000 ethnic Azerbaijanis. There is no legitimate defensive reason for Armenia to plant landmines under gravestones in the Agdam region, which had a population of over 100,000 ethnic Azerbaijanis. And there is no legitimate defensive reason for Armenia to bury landmines in agricultural fields away from the line of contact that until recently were in active use. The only purpose of Armenia's actions is to prevent the ethnic Azerbaijanis who had been displaced from those areas from returning home. Equally, the timing of Armenia's placement of landmines confirms its discriminatory purpose. As part of its scorched earth policy, Armenia planted landmines even as it withdrew from the formerly occupied territories. In the same way that Armenian forces burned homes and schools and destroyed infrastructure, even removing telephone wires, rather than allow Azerbaijanis to step foot inside, Armenian forces salted the earth with landmines to ensure that Azerbaijanis could not safely return to their homes. Second, even if the discriminatory purpose of the landmines were not clear, there is no argument about the effect of Armenia's conduct, which suffices for purposes of plausibility. In this posture, coming after the cessation of active hostilities last November, the question is not Armenia's purpose in planting mines in Azerbaijan's territory along the border as a defensive measure, but rather its obligation now to facilitate the clearance of landmines it planted in Azerbaijan's territory because of the discriminatory effect on ethnic Azerbaijanis seeking to return home. Armenia's failure to provide critical information that could safeguard civilian lives in Azerbaijan's territory could have no possible defensive purpose for Armenia in the posture in which these provisional measures requests arise. And the effect on ethnic Azerbaijanis is clear. Those that attempt to return home remain at constant risk of landmines. Their deaths, injuries, and continued exclusion from the territories they call home represent the ongoing effects of Armenia's landmines and its refusal to provide information about their locations. The international community recognizes the devastating and discriminatory effects of Armenia's refusal to provide Azerbaijan with landmine maps. The European Parliament, for example, noted in May 2021 that, quote, up-to-date maps of minefields, end quote, would, quote, permit civilians to return to former conflict regions, end quote. Other international actors recognize the continuing, quote, civilian casualties, end quote, ongoing death and injury, end quote, and, quote, horrific injuries and incidents, end quote, that result. Between March and October this year, international organizations and states reiterated the call for Armenia to urgently disclose its landmine maps to Azerbaijan over 15 times. Further, while Armenia appeared to argue yesterday that its placement of landmines is a separate matter governed by other international legal regimes, citing to the Ottawa Treaty, to which Armenia is not even party, this misses the point. In its order on provisional measures in Georgia v. Russia, the court accepted that acts may contravene CERD, quote, even if they might also be covered by other rules of international law, including humanitarian law, end quote. the key test is whether the acts fall within the definition of racial discrimination under Article 1 of the CERD. Third, Armenia also argues that Azerbaijan's request must fail because landmines have been a, quote, long-standing problem, end quote, in this area and include unexploded ordnances, and therefore engages in the speculation that a civilian death today may be a consequence of a landmine laid in the First Karabakh War. I need not tarry on this point, since it is clear that attribution for planting the landmines is not appropriate for determination on provisional measures. As the court held in Georgia v. Russia, quote, it cannot at this stage make definitive findings of fact nor a finding of attribution, end quote. In any event, however much it tries now to suggest that it is, quote, unclear, end quote, that Armenia laid mines during the Second Karabakh War, Armenia cannot deny that it holds vital information about the location of the landmines. Just a few months ago, Armenia provided maps purportedly outlining the location of 189,000 mines. Armenia also cannot deny that it has provided what Armenia's prime minister openly admits is only, quote, tiny part, end quote, of the information it holds, and it does not deny that the information it has provided has been woefully inadequate. Armenia's ongoing refusal to provide accurate information about the location of the landmines, independently of its original placement of the mines, continues to prevent displaced ethnic Azerbaijanis from returning home. Armenia also cannot make its CERD obligations conditional by taking refuge in its offer to provide its landmine maps only if Azerbaijan grants blanket immunity to Armenians who are being tried for or have been convicted of serious crimes. Yesterday, Armenia's agents stated that Armenia would, quote, stand ready, end quote, to provide more maps, but with an important caveat, that is, quote, in the context of resolving all outstanding humanitarian issues, end quote. This is very much the same as prior so-called offers. Armenia's position has been consistent that it will not provide landmine maps, and the, quote, humanitarian issue, quote, referenced is how Armenia's prime minister has referred to the release of Armenian detainees, not, as suggested yesterday, that Armenia stands willing to provide, quote, maps that have a humanitarian significance, end quote. Likewise, Armenia's suggestion that it is, quote, fully willing to cooperate with United Nations and regional systems with non-governmental organizations, end quote, notably does not include Azerbaijan. Such a conditional offer is illusory. As Lord Goldsmith explained last week, Azerbaijan has a sovereign right and in some instances an obligation under CERD to pursue such cases. It is extraordinary for Armenia to trumpet its demand that Azerbaijan let convicted torturers walk free before Armenia will provide urgently required life-saving information. In sum, it is clear that Azerbaijan has established breaches of plausible rights under CERD and an imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to those rights. I turn now to Armenia's two arguments with respect to the court's prima facie jurisdiction. Armenia's argument on jurisdiction ratio materiae cannot withstand scrutiny. Armenia suggested that Azerbaijan's request is flawed because the, quote, request concerning demining is based on alleged harmful effects to Azerbaijan nationals as a whole, not to persons of any particular ethnic origin, end quote. First, the hearing before the court is a request for provisional measures in which only a prima facie finding of jurisdiction need to be made. The court is not in a position to make determinations on contested jurisdictional grounds, as these are matters to be properly resolved at the merits phase. But in addition, by focusing on irrelevant issues of nationality, Armenia also has sought to recast Azerbaijan's claims for its own purposes, and in so doing misstates them. Azerbaijan's application is premised on a claim of discrimination against, quote, Azerbaijanis as an ethnic origin or national origin group, and not in relation to nationality or citizenship, end quote. It does not rest on a complaint about adverse effects caused to nationals. crux of Azerbaijan's claim is that Armenia's extensive landmining activities and its continued refusal to assist with Azerbaijan's demining program has kept displaced ethnic Azerbaijanis from returning to their homes in the formerly occupied territories. These acts and omissions have both the purpose and the effect of impairing the fundamental rights of Azerbaijanis, to quote the court, as a distinct social group based on their national or ethnic origin, end quote. It is clear even at this stage that Armenia's purported ratio materia objection lacks merit. Armenia also suggested yesterday that the court lacked jurisdiction ratio temporis. Again, this argument can be dealt with swiftly, as these are matters to be properly resolved at the merits phase. While CERD entered into force between the parties in August 1996, the planting of landmines which preceded it formed part of Armenia's ongoing and systematic policy of ethnic cleansing towards ethnic Azerbaijanis living in the formerly occupied territories. Armenia's conduct constituted an act whose continuing character violated Azerbaijan's rights under CERD once it entered into force between the state parties, and which continues until such time as the landmines are removed. International courts and tribunals have been clear that a court is permitted to take account of facts arising prior to the entry into force in order to understand violations which occurred thereafter if the breach manifests a continuing character. The planting of individual landmines may have been instantaneous acts, but by restricting ethnic Azerbaijanis from returning to their homes and villages, Armenia's violation of CERD persists to the present day. Finally, I turn to Armenia's argument that the second request should fail because Azerbaijan cannot establish that Armenia has continued to plant landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. This argument is misconceived and should be rejected. For the avoidance of doubt, Azerbaijan does not accept this unsubstantiated assertion that recent mining activity is limited to Armenian territory. The evidence submitted to the court confirms that Armenian soldiers continue to plant deadly landmines on Azerbaijan's territory, to the detriment of Azerbaijanis. The only evidence to the contrary is Armenia's say-so. Mr. Donovan will address the nature of the representation made by Armenia yesterday, but suffice it to say the court is not required to determine these contested issues at the provisional measure stage. Of course, as both the parties have publicly acknowledged, the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia is still in the process of being demarcated. So even on Armenia's case, for as long as Armenia continues to plant deadly landmines in disputed border regions, Armenia's actions are likely to cause significant and irreparable prejudice to the rights of Azerbaijanis, including under Article 2 and 5 of CERD, and there is plausible prejudice to those rights. Madam President, honorable members of the court, I now turn to Azerbaijan's request that Armenia prevent organizations within its territory from engaging in incitement to violence against Azerbaijanis and cease its cyber disinformation operations that also incite and promote ethnic hatred. With respect to Azerbaijan's claims of incitement to violence, I'll make 3 points. First, with respect to armed hate groups such as VOMA and POGA, Armenia argued yesterday that these groups are, quote, non-governmental actors, end quote, engaged in, quote, purely private, end quote, speech. Armenia seems to suggest that armed hate groups can operate openly, notoriously, and with impunity from its territory as long as they're not governmental actors. That is not what CERD requires. To the contrary, Armenia is obliged under CERD Article 4 to, quote, condemn all organizations which are based on ideas or theories of superiority of one race or ethnic origin, end quote. Quote, prohibit organizations which promote and incite racial discrimination, end quote. And, quote, recognize participation in such organizations as an offense punishable by law, end quote. And in any case, Azerbaijan has provided the court with evidence that Armenia is not just turning a blind eye to these groups. Its armed forces have worked, quote, in close cooperation, end quote, with VOMA fighters and granted them a commendation by the command. And the Armenian Ministry of Emergency Situations has conducted joint exercises with a local branch. This conduct also violates Armenia's obligation under Article 2.1b, quote, not to sponsor, defend, or support racial discrimination by any persons or organizations, end quote. Second, Armenia suggests that its CERD obligations are not triggered because VOMA and POGA are not engaged in prohibited hate speech. But this ignores entirely the record of evidence demonstrating that VOMA intentionally stokes ethnic hatred of Azerbaijanis by demonizing them as, for example, a people that pose an existential, quote, threat, end quote, to Armenians, while simultaneously dehumanizing them by denying their very existence as a distinct ethnic group, repeatedly referring to them as a people, quote, with a nomad mentality, end quote, or, quote, Caspian Turks, end quote. Both VOMA and POGA also explicitly advocate and broadcast the teachings of Garagan Nejdeh, who was a Nazi collaborator and founder of the racist Segakron ideology that contravenes Article 4's prohibition on, quote, ideas or theories of superiority of one race, end quote. VOMA and POGA invoke Nejdeh as part of their campaigns to use violence against Azerbaijanis to claim Azerbaijanis territories for Armenia. Armenia also argues that VOMA and POGA are not, quote, armed hate groups, end quote, that incite racial violence, but that their focus is instead, to borrow emphasis from Dr. Salanidis, quote, clearly self-defense and emergency response, end quote. Azerbaijan also thinks the focus of these groups is clear, and we've collected their own words on the subject at tabs 5 and 6 of your folders. I invite the court to review them and note that they include calls for, quote, liquidating Azerbaijan, end quote, conducting, quote, 99% of the war games on land resembling Azerbaijani territory, end quote, engaging in, quote, acts of sabotage, end quote, and ensuring that the army will not just, quote, be a defensive force, but one that fights on all fronts, end quote. This is not self-defense. Tabs 5 and 6 of your folders also collate some of the racial slurs and veneration of Nejdeh employed by VOMA and POGA across their platforms, while tab 7 provides a selection of the teachings of Nejdeh. We invite the court to review these materials as a whole. This is not, quote, nationalistic and patriotic talk, end quote, that is merely, quote, controversial, end quote, as suggested yesterday, but rather statements of ethnic hate and cultural erasure directed at denigrating Azerbaijanis. Coupled with the racist ideology that animates these calls to arms, this is incitement to racially motivated violence targeting Azerbaijanis and more than plausibly engages rights under Article 4 of CERD. Not only does Armenia fail to condemn this racist ideology, but as Professor Boisson de Chazourne noted yesterday, it glorifies it. Third, this is a continuing, urgent threat. VOMA and POGA are actively fundraising and training recruits in pursuit of their violent and racist goals. The CERD committee lists the, quote, development and organization of militia groups and or extreme political groups based on a racist platform, end quote, as a key factor for the activation of its early warning and urgent action procedures, which are meant to prevent serious violations of CERD, and, quote, in particular those that could lead to ethnic conflict and violence, end quote. There is good reason for this. Such groups are made up of armed civilians with little or no training in rules of combat or international humanitarian law, with no clear command structure or oversight. In these conditions, the risks posed by speech inciting violence more than meet the threshold for imminence and urgency. I turn now to Azerbaijan's request for an order related to Armenia's cyber disinformation campaign. Armenia's responsive arguments boils down to 3 points. First, yesterday afternoon, Armenia tried to sow doubt about the extent of its involvement in the disinformation campaign, claiming that, quote, Twitter is not so sure, end quote, that, quote, Armenia has direct ties to these accounts, end quote. There's no such doubt. At tab 16 in your judges folders, you will find statements from Twitter describing its methodology. Twitter only discloses data sets of removed tweets, as it did for Armenia, where they are, quote, associated with coordinated malicious activity that Twitter is able to reliably associate with state-affiliated actors, end quote. Twitter explains that it requires, quote, clear, verifiable associations between accounts we identify and state-affiliated actors, end quote, and that, quote, disclosure of data sets requires additional evidence of coordinated, state-backed activity, end quote. Thus, contrary to Armenia's argument, Twitter makes clear that when it identifies a network as state-linked, it is, in fact, sure that is the case. Second, in arguing that the Twitter campaign does not invoke plausible rights under CERD, Armenia focuses exclusively on 3 sample tweets Azerbaijan provided from the dataset, and attempts to dismiss them as failing to qualify as hate speech. But the first 2 fake tweets spread blatantly anti-Azerbaijani messages. And while Dr. Salonides characterized the 3rd tweet as, quote, clearly satirical, end quote, it is unclear how a fake anti-Armenian message that appeared to emanate from an Azerbaijani account would be perceived as remotely satirical, as opposed to designed to foment hatred. Armenia ignores entirely numerous other examples, including those at pages 6, 10, and 13 of the Stanford report, as well as the evidence of a coordinated government effort to spread disinformation about Azerbaijanis, consisting of, on the Twitter platform alone, more than 70,000 tweets and spanning at least 7 years, including over 1,000 tweets from 2019 and 2020. Third, Armenia attempts to minimize the ongoing harm of its campaign, arguing that the network of 35 accounts has now been removed. But state-backed disinformation campaigns are so insidious precisely because they are pervasive and nearly impossible to detect without the assistance of a third party with access to the relevant data, such as Twitter. This one network of 35 accounts must be understood as the tip of a very deep iceberg. State disinformation operations are, quote, churned out at scale, injected in a coordinated and systematic manner, often across multiple platforms, end quote, and, quote, over a sustained period of time, end quote. And the harm caused by such campaigns is severe. According to an April 2021 study by the European Parliament, online, quote, disinformation is associated with a rise in more dramatic and grave digital violence. Coordinated online hate speech against racial and ethnic minorities has led to violence in different places, end quote. Notably, yesterday the court did not hear an outward denial that Armenia was responsible for the Twitter disinformation campaign. Just deflection saying there is, quote, no need, end quote, for Armenia to engage in such conduct. Due to the irreparable harm that these campaigns can cause and the difficulty inherent in identifying, removing, and remedying such campaigns, provisional measures are warranted. Thank you, Madam President, honorable members of the court, for the privilege of appearing before you. I now respectfully request you to invite Ms. Natalie Reid to address the court.
I thank Ms. Amirfar for her statement, and I now invite the next speaker, Ms. Natalie Reid, to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, honorable members of the court, in my remarks this morning, I will explain why Armenia has failed to defeat Azerbaijan's showing of the urgent need for an order to preserve evidence of SURD violations. Armenia argued yesterday that Azerbaijan's request is not linked to plausible rights under SURD, and that provisional measures are neither required nor appropriate. Professor Darjon described these arguments as a series of, quote, obstacles that supposedly imperiled Azerbaijan's request. None of those arguments, however, withstands scrutiny. First, Azerbaijan's request seeks to protect the well-established right under Article 6 of SURD to effective protection and remedies against acts of racial discrimination. Armenia did not dispute that this right exists. It did not dispute that Article 6 requires a prompt and effective investigation of credible allegations of ethnically motivated offenses, including the hate crimes I described yesterday. And Armenia did not dispute. In fact, it agreed that it is on notice of precisely such credible, substantiated allegations of crimes committed by its servicemen against Azerbaijanis. Instead, Armenia tried to change the subject. It complained that Azerbaijan is attempting to turn SURD into a mutual legal assistance treaty, and argued that Azerbaijan had not explained which state would ultimately be prosecuting these crimes. Let us be clear. Azerbaijan's request is not a squabble over jurisdiction. It is squarely aimed at one thing: ensuring that the evidence of SURD violations is preserved. As I explained yesterday, the only way to assure preservation of evidence of crimes that will otherwise disappear or degrade is to conduct a prompt and effective investigation. Armenia is currently subject to an undisputed duty to carry out such investigations, and it is currently breaching that duty and thereby prejudicing the right of Azerbaijanis to the protection and remedies to which they are entitled under SURD. Azerbaijan's fourth requested measure simply seeks to protect that right. So much for the first obstacle. Armenia also argued that Azerbaijan's request for an evidence preservation order should be rejected because it is independent of the other provisional measures Azerbaijan seeks and does not complement or support them. But there is no requirement that a requested measure be linked to other measures sought. What must be shown, and what Azerbaijan has demonstrated, is a link to plausible rights. The fact that the legal and factual bases for this request are distinct from those underlying Azerbaijan's other requests highlights the breadth and variety of Armenia's conduct that threatens rights protected by SURD. It is no obstacle to granting the order sought. Second, the measure requested is necessary to ensure preservation of evidence of SURD violations as such, namely, evidence of the purpose or effect of an act or omission that renders that conduct a breach of the Convention. Armenia's arguments and evidentiary submissions yesterday did not alter that conclusion. Instead, they reinforced the serious concerns animating Azerbaijan's request. Armenia has argued that there is no need for provisional measures because it is already investigating allegations of crimes committed by its servicemen against Azerbaijanis. I explained yesterday that Armenia had not offered this court any indication that it was conducting investigations that are, and I quote from the May 2021 report discussed yesterday, independent, prompt, public, and effective. I noted that the single page Armenia had submitted to this court was not nearly enough. In response, Armenia submitted, for the first time, a communication it sent to 3 UN Special Rapporteurs in April 2021, in which it stated that it had opened 6 cases regarding videos of crimes committed by Armenian servicemen in December 2020. That document is at tab 4 of Armenia's judges folder from yesterday. As you will see, the relevant portion of the communication, the response to question 2 from the Special Rapporteurs, is 2 pages long. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that we now have twice as much information as we did yesterday about Armenia's compliance with its evidence preservation obligation. We do not. In fact, once you take away the description of each video, that is, the summary of what is apparent on the face of the recording itself, all that is left is the statement that, quote, a criminal case was initiated, end quote, and a reference to the relevant provision of the Armenian Criminal Code. In short, when it comes to the actual investigative steps that Armenia has taken or failed to take in these cases, we know nothing more than we did yesterday. And in any event, we all know that there are far more than 6 allegations, or even 6 videos. Armenia has provided no information about interrogation of any witnesses, no information about any forensic analysis, such as examinations of mobile phones, social media, or the video evidence itself, no information about any requests for records or cooperation sent to other agencies in Armenia. If those steps sound familiar, it is because they are what one would expect from an effective investigation. Indeed, those are the steps that Azerbaijan has taken when investigating its own servicemen. They are also the steps that Armenia itself follows when, to use the phrase employed by Professor Darjan yesterday, it, quote, takes its prosecution obligations seriously, end quote. In stark contrast to its apparent recalcitrance in investigating crimes against Azerbaijanis, Armenia's Prosecutor General has recently trumpeted the, quote, unprecedented volume, end quote, of cases that it is pursuing against Armenian citizens for crimes against the state, including more than 2,000 criminal cases for offenses such as treason, avoiding conscription, and theft of military equipment. That press release from the end of September 2021 is at tab 17 of your folders. You will see that Armenia reports remarkable progress in these cases, stating that it has already carried out, quote, large-scale judicial operative investigative measures, end quote, including conducting over 20 searches and seizures, questioning over 150 people, including the Armenian president and the commander of Defense Army, and undertaking other, quote, proper investigative and procedural actions, end quote. As of September 2021, the Armenian prosecutors had reached decisions on the involvement of over 800 accused, including high-ranking officers, and sent 48 criminal cases implicating 55 defendants to court. So it is clear that Armenia can take such steps against its own servicemen when it wants to. It is equally clear from the record before the court that it has not taken similar steps when it comes to the vicious crimes committed against Azerbaijanis. Armenia's record speaks for itself, as does the contrasting record of the Azerbaijani prosecutors. And Armenia cannot distract from its failures by misquoting or misstating what the Azerbaijani authorities have said or done, as Armenia's counsel tried to do yesterday. But it is not just the lack of information and apparent lack of progress that underscore the need for the provisional measure sought. Closer review of the little information Armenia has provided indicates that it is not conducting investigations under provisions of its own laws that expressly recognize certain offenses as hate crimes, and that punish such crimes with harsher sanctions. In other words, there is evidence that unless ordered by this court, Armenia will not pursue charges and thus will not preserve evidence relating specifically to ethnically motivated crimes. To explain, as I outlined yesterday, several of the most serious allegations against Armenian servicemen involve desecration of the corpses of Azerbaijani servicemen, including conduct intended to humiliate and violate their dignity, committed with ethnic animus. These are especially heinous crimes, and Armenian law recognizes them as such. We see that from 2 provisions of the Armenian Criminal Code, which we will show on the screen now, and which are in your folders at tabs 13 and 19. The English language text that we will show is taken directly from the website of the Armenian Parliament. Article 265 of the Armenian Criminal Code expressly recognizes that the crime of outrageous treatment of a dead body should be punished more seriously, given what is called a hate crime enhancement in some national jurisdictions, when committed due to motives of national, racial, or religious hatred. Article 390, paragraph 4, likewise specifically recognizes and prescribes other inhuman and degrading practices involving outrages upon personal dignity based on racial discrimination. Investigating crimes under these provisions would require specific attention to these distinctive features, including the identification, collection, and preservation of evidence of the perpetrator's motives, precisely the kind of evidence that would characterize a CERD breach. But the little information provided confirms that Armenia is not conducting any investigations under those provisions. Instead, according to both the single page submitted to this court and the 2 pages submitted to the special rapporteurs, Armenia is only investigating crimes under Article 390, subparagraphs 1.1 and 1.2 of the Code. As the CERD Committee has explained, a state cannot meet its duty under Article 6 unless it conducts a thorough investigation by public authorities of the possible racist nature of the attack. Because if the possibility is set aside at the level of the criminal investigation, it will thereby prevent the issue from even being adjudicated at the criminal trial. In short, Armenia's own submissions confirm that without an order from this court, Armenia will not comply with its specific CERD obligation to preserve, through investigations, evidence of racial discrimination as such. Without provisional measures in this case, such critical evidence of the defining feature of CERD violations will be lost. As to the remaining supposed obstacles for Azerbaijan's request, I can be brief. First, no professed confidentiality concerns can excuse Armenia's failure to provide the court with information on its investigations, either now or if ordered to do so at regular intervals. As Armenia well knows, it can seek confidential treatment under the rules of court, and the provision of its own laws it invokes, Article 201, subparagraph 1 of the Criminal Procedure Code, does not in fact prevent disclosure by prosecution authorities. In fact, as confirmed by the text of that law available from the Armenian Parliament at tab 18 in your folders, the provision empowers the competent officials to authorize disclosure. Finally, Armenia suggested yesterday that the court would somehow be departing from its existing jurisprudence if it granted Azerbaijan's request. That is incorrect. Although the precise language used may vary, the court's orders on preservation of evidence all address the same fundamental concern, that critical evidence of CERD violations would be lost. For instance, in Cameroon versus Nigeria, the court noted that armed actions within the Ter-Petrosian dispute could jeopardize the existence of evidence relevant to the present case, and ordered the parties to take all necessary steps to conserve evidence relevant to the present case within the disputed area, even though there was no specific evidence that either side's armed forces were seeking to actively destroy relevant evidence. The same real and imminent risk exists in this case. Critical evidence of acts of racial discrimination will be lost if Armenia does not take urgent steps to preserve it. The provisional measures Azerbaijan seeks can prevent that loss. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, it has been an honor to appear before you. I thank you for your kind attention, and I invite you to call Mr. Donovan.
I thank Ms. Reed. Donald Donovan.
Madame la Présidente, Mesdames, Messieurs les juges, j'ai l'honneur de vous adresser une autre fois au nom de la République d'Azerbaïdjan. Au cours des derniers jours, nous avons rappelé la discipline qu'exerce la Cour lorsqu'elle décide d'une demande en indication de mesures conservatoires. Les critères précis d'une partie demanderesse doivent satisfaire l'article 41 qui fournit le fondement en cette matière. Ces critères sont bien établis. Les parties ne les contestent point. Mais tandis qu'hier l'Arménie cherchait à aborder soi-disant les mesures conservatoires et leurs critères, elle a soulevé de nombreuses questions qui n'ont pas de pertinence par rapport aux questions idoines. Les questions de procédure, savoir qu'il n'y a aucune pertinence par rapport à la solidité des prétentions des partis quant au fond ou leurs arguments sur les mesures conservatoires. De même, les griefs que peut avoir l'Azerbaïdjan contre l'Arménie contre l'Azerbaïdjan ne peuvent servir de distraction par rapport à la détermination de la requête de l'Azerbaïdjan. Venons-en aux mines terrestres. L'utilisation historique des mines dans des lieux sans rapport n'a pas de pertinence quant à savoir si dans les faits de la présente espèce, il y a une base permettant de conclure que l'Arménie a recours aux mines terrestres ou s'abstenait de les éliminer dans le cadre d'une campagne de nettoyage ethnique de long terme. De même,
to Azerbaijan's third rights on hate speech. Whether the violent and racist anti-Azerbaijani hate speech from organizations like VOMA and POGA is private or public speech is irrelevant to Armenia's obligation under CERD Article 4B to prohibit organizations, including private organizations, from promoting and inciting racial discrimination. And as to preservation of evidence, whether there are international mechanisms for obtaining mutual legal assistance is irrelevant to whether Armenia's failure to investigate and thereby collect and preserve evidence of ethnically motivated crimes implicates plausible CERD rights. Likewise, whether the order sought by Azerbaijan is similar to or different than the broad preservation order requested by Armenia last week is irrelevant to the determination whether the order sought by Azerbaijan, standing on its own, meets the settled criteria. In short, none of these matters, and others like them, has any bearing on whether Azerbaijan has plausible CERD rights that are at imminent risk of irreparable prejudice from Armenia's acts and failures to act. When we turn to the issues that matter in satisfying the court's criteria, Azerbaijan's case is clear-cut. Yesterday morning, and again today, my colleagues have walked the court through the evidence and demonstrated, measure by measure, why Azerbaijan's request must be granted. But there is one remaining point that I wish to address. Madam President, members of the court, I put the issue to you this way. Especially considering the extremely serious threats to human life, safety, and the administration of justice raised by Azerbaijan's request, could there be any possible prejudice to Armenia in issuing the measures requested? The answer we submit is no. I will take Azerbaijan's 4 specific requested measures in reverse order. First, Azerbaijan requests that Armenia take effective measures to collect and preserve evidence related to allegations of ethnically motivated hate crimes against Azerbaijanis, of which it is aware. That final qualifier is key. The evidence shows that Armenia is on notice of multiple credible and substantiated allegations of ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis. As it stands, Armenia is currently in breach of its obligation under CERD Article 6 to effectively investigate, which Azerbaijan's requested measure seeks to safeguard. Let there be no doubt, unless Armenia is ordered to collect and preserve evidence, it is at risk of being lost or destroyed at any time, which would permanently impair, if not deprive, Azerbaijani victims of effective remedies as required by CERD. With actual knowledge of credible allegations of ethnically motivated crimes, it is hard to understand how Armenia could object to an obligation that it collect and preserve evidence of those allegations. Second, Azerbaijan requests that organizations operating in Armenia, such as VOMA and POGA, be prevented from inciting racial hatred and racially motivated violence targeted at Azerbaijanis. The evidence shows that these are militant, ethno-nationalist groups operating with impunity in Armenia, who spew a racist, violent ideology targeting Azerbaijanis. They are recruiting and training for deadly warfare with Azerbaijanis, which Armenia tries to dismiss as self-defense and emergency response. In addition, Azerbaijan requests that Armenia cease and desist its ongoing anti-Azerbaijani cyber disinformation campaign. While Armenia yesterday tried to minimize the evidentiary record to just 3 tweets, let's be clear. The evidence amassed includes thousands upon thousands of tweets from fake accounts all tied to Armenia. As to both these requests, there is no conceivable basis on which Armenia might contend that it would be prejudiced. Armenia's own laws envisage it will clamp down on virulent hate groups like VOMA, and it is difficult to conceive of any legitimate interest Armenia has in fomenting racial animosity, either in its own territory or online. Third, Azerbaijan requests that Armenia provide comprehensive and accurate information on the location and characteristics of landmines in Azerbaijan. These are lethal objects deposited by Armenia with the purpose and effect of cleansing Azerbaijani territory of ethnic Azerbaijanis and preventing them from returning to their homeland. Ethnic cleansing surely implicates CERD rights and more than meets the plausibility standard. The irreparable prejudice is plain. People may die at any minute. Armenia's resistance to this request is truly puzzling. It does not deny that it has more maps than it has given Azerbaijan. Indeed, it has offered these maps in exchange for concessions from Azerbaijan. Those maps would have the virtually immediate effect of saving lives. And at this juncture, it should not matter to Armenia whether those lives are those of ethnic Azerbaijanis, ethnic Armenians, or members of other ethnic groups. Again, at this juncture, the court should not indulge an argument that Armenia can continue to withhold the maps because the mines that they would identify kill and maim indiscriminately. Finally, Azerbaijan requests that Armenia cease and desist planting landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. The measure would facilitate the return of displaced Azerbaijanis to their homeland and safeguard the rights Azerbaijan asserts under Articles 2 and 5. Yesterday afternoon, the agent of Armenia represented that, quote, Armenia is not planting landmines in the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan, end quote. And that, quote, Armenia respects and abides by its obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force under Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter of the United Nations. Professor Murphy then repeated those two statements to argue that Azerbaijan's request is now moot. With respect, it is not. On behalf of Armenia, the agent has not undertaken plainly and simply that Armenia will not lay any landmines in Azerbaijan's territory in the future. If that is what Armenia means, Armenia should just say it, so that the court may take note of that public, formal, unequivocal undertaking and bind Armenia in accord with its terms. Since that is the impression Armenia appears to be trying to convey, it cannot suggest that its own legitimate interests would be harmed by such an undertaking. But again, If Armenia is unwilling to give that unequivocal assurance, the court should incorporate the obligation in a provisional measure. Madam President, I thank you for your kind attention. I ask that you now invite the agent for the Republic of Azerbaijan, Mr. Mavlonov, to the podium.
I thank Mr. Donovan, and I now give the floor to the agent of Azerbaijan, His Excellency Mr. Elnur Mammadov. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Madam President, honorable members of the court, it is my privilege to address you once again and to close these submissions by the Republic of Azerbaijan. The agent of Armenia suggested yesterday that Azerbaijan has come before the court solely to, quote, mirror Armenia's claims, and seems to attach great import to being the first past the courtroom door. But Azerbaijan believes it is better to be right than to be first. Azerbaijan negotiated in good faith and turned to the court only after Armenia walked away without engaging on Azerbaijan's proposals. Azerbaijan has provided clear, credible evidence of actions and omissions by Armenia that more than plausibly engage rights on the third and explain the real risk of irreparable harm that ensues from each. And Azerbaijan has identified specific, concrete measures the court could order to protect against these threats pending a decision on the merits. Madam President, Azerbaijan is here to request the court's urgent assistance in safeguarding the rights and the rights of Azerbaijanis on the third. As demonstrated by our written and oral submissions, certain of those rights are under imminent, ongoing threat of irreparable harm. From the ever-present threat of landmines that Armenia continues to leverage to threaten Azerbaijanis and prevent them from returning home, from armed hate groups actively inciting violence against Azerbaijanis with the blessing and support of the Armenian state, from pervasive disinformation cyber operations designed to perpetuate the cycle of anti-Azerbaijani hatred, and from Armenia's abject failure to effectively investigate and preserve evidence related to this and numerous other credible allegations of ethnic crimes targeting Azerbaijanis. I shall now read out the Republic of Azerbaijan's final submissions. On the basis of the facts and law set out in the application and request for provisional measures of 23rd September 2021, and for the reasons explained during these hearings, the Republic of Azerbaijan respectfully asks the court to indicate the following provisional measures. A. Armenia shall take all necessary steps to enable Azerbaijan to undertake the prompt, safe, and effective demining of the landmines laid in Azerbaijan's territory by the Armenian military and/or other groups under the direction, control, or sponsorship of Armenia, including by immediately providing comprehensive and accurate information about the location and characteristics of landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. B. Armenia shall immediately cease and desist from endangering the lives of Azerbaijanis by planting or promoting or facilitating the planting of landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. C. Armenia shall take all necessary steps effectively to prevent organizations operating in Armenian territory, including the VOMA organization, from engaging in the incitement of racial hatred and racially motivated violence targeted at Azerbaijanis, and immediately shall cease and desist incitement based on the fabrication of public and private hate speech attributed to Azerbaijanis on Twitter and other social media and traditional media channels. D. Armenia shall take effective measures to collect and to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of ethnically motivated crimes against Azerbaijanis, of which it is aware, including those identified in communications from the Republic of Azerbaijan. E. Armenia shall refrain from any measure that might aggravate, extend, or make more difficult the resolution of this dispute. And finally, F. Armenia shall submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to its order indicating provisional measures within 3 months as from the date of the order, and thereafter every 6 months until a final decision on the case is rendered by the court. Madam President, honorable members of the court, I thank you for your kind attention to this urgent matter. I would also like to thank all members of the registry and the interpreters for their dedicated work throughout the hearings. Thank you.
I thank the agent of Azerbaijan, whose statement brings to an end the second round of oral argument of Azerbaijan, as well as this morning's sitting. The court will meet again this afternoon at 5 p.m. to hear the second round of oral argument of the Republic of Armenia. The sitting is adjourned.